alongside those technical skills that you have as a project manager, I also feel that the biggest contribution you can have as a project manager is...
Gaya, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Andre. Good to be here.
Thank you very much for accepting the invite. Actually, you were recommended to me by Natalie. I reached out to her first because I see her articles everywhere. Everybody's talking about her articles. And she was like, I'm not busy, but my team is so awesome. Pick one of them. And she recommended you because I told her that I haven't had a chance to speak to someone about project management so far, which is surprising to me because I've been doing project management for most of my career in localization. And that's when she recommended you. And she said that you're great at project management because you don't think about project management in the standard way. That for you, project management is more about relationships. So that's why I'm happy to have you here. And our episode will be focused mainly on project management / program management, because that's what you explained to me, that you're kind of like a mixed role. But before we get to that, you work at HubSpot.
Yes.
Teaser. Spoiler alert. But how did you get into localization? I know you started in a company that's also familiar to me as well. So how do you remember your first beginning with localization?
First of all, Natalie set a very high bar. I hope I can meet that expectation.
No pressure, no pressure.
Well, I'm definitely very excited to be on the podcast, and I hope this will prove to be useful and I can meet the expectations that Natalie has set already. To answer your question, my journey to localization was a long one. So I actually started in business administration, and that's what I studied.
You are young.
That's true. I'm glad that it doesn't feel like that to me sometimes.
Right.
Thank you. I actually started in general business administration, and that's what I studied in my undergraduate degree.
Mm-hmm.
Very quickly, I noticed that I love languages and I love translation. And although when I was younger, everybody thought that would be the natural path for me, translation and language services, I was really opposed to it at the beginning. I kind of thought, that's the traditional path. I'm not going to go down that path. I come from a multilingual family. I come from an immigrant background, and we came to the US when I was 8. I grew up speaking multiple languages at home, and everybody kind of pointed me toward the language path, but I resisted for a long time and decided to do something broader, business administration. But there was no getting away from it.
Did you think that the whole industry is only about translating things and there's nothing else?
That was my impression.
Right?
Yeah. In college, I think, at least at the time, we didn't have a lot of exposure to localization as a discipline. I think it's not something that is commonly introduced on the college undergraduate level. So to me, it was really about translation, which of course has many merits and it's a very important function, but I didn't see myself in that profile because I always thought of myself as someone who's very outgoing, and I wanted to have that people contact, which you don't really get to have that often as a translator. So I resisted for a long time, but things kind of happened in their own natural way. And I ended up working as a freelance translator for a nonprofit organization at first. And then I was a translator and interpreter for the Swiss International Development Organization back when I was an undergraduate student. I was completely self-taught, had no idea what I was doing, especially at the beginning. But I really enjoyed my experience. And when I left my college and went out into the real world, I thought I'd give this whole business thing a try and actually apply what I learned at university. I worked for a small organization in Los Angeles, so in the for-profit world, and I was a sales and marketing manager by the time that I left that organization. So I already had quite a bit of experience in business, but I felt like something was missing. The company was primarily targeting domestic business, so I didn't feel like I was applying that international background, which is what really gave me energy and motivated me all along. So I decided to go back to university after just a short year of being out of university. And that's when I went to the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and got my master's there. You briefly alluded to Autodesk, which I think is what you were referring to when you mentioned. We have that part of our resumes in common.
Yes.
Autodesk was my first experience after being at MISS, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. I learned so much, and I think I took so much away from that experience. Working with Hannah Choi and all the program managers at Autodesk was the first formal, really sophisticated program, localization program that I had seen firsthand. And the stakeholder management aspect of working in such a large program was invaluable and a really great takeaway.
Did they have any formal training for you during your internship, or did you just learn and observe everyone how they were doing? What were you actually doing there during your internship?
So there was, of course, some structure, and my memory is pretty rusty by this point, but there was, of course, some structured training. I remember getting hands-on training from the program managers on how the programs look. And I recall at the time that there was also quite a bit of IETN infrastructure being developed. And that is also something that I got to have a behind-the-scenes look at. But a lot of it was learning by doing. And that's what I enjoyed a lot about it, because after having had so much theory in class, it was nice to actually apply it.
Yeah, absolutely. So now you work at HubSpot. HubSpot is a very famous marketing tool, SaaS software, but maybe some people don't know what exactly HubSpot does. Is it only for marketers and salespeople? Can you give us a brief overview of what HubSpot is and where the localization fits in?
Absolutely. So I'll probably give you my own interpretation of what HubSpot does. There's definitely an official written definition of what HubSpot does. But the way I see HubSpot as a tool, it's supposed to help companies support the entire customer flywheel. And we use the word flywheel a lot. The way we understand a flywheel is contrary to the traditional funnel where you have prospects going in, customers coming out. A flywheel is really, it's the customer is at the center, and all of the operations, so sales, marketing, services, and anything beyond just the customer, a prospect converting to a customer, fits into that flywheel. And the purpose is to make sure that the customer is always being serviced and delighted throughout their journey and interaction with the company. So the way that fits into HubSpot as a tool, because what I just described, it's an ideology on which HubSpot is based. It's as a tool, we look at the customer as being at the center, and everything else that is built around it is supporting the customer. And the way HubSpot fits into that is the different hubs that are developed as part of HubSpot support these different functions like marketing, sales, services, and beyond, to make sure that sales and marketing and services are all tied together, and you don't have these disconnected conversations where you call to get your contract renewed, but the contract renewal specialist doesn't actually know what happened from the very beginning of your account. There is an actual connection that gets built around a customer, and the tool helps support that.
Where is localization? Is localization one of the parts of the wheel, or is it something that supports all parts of the wheel?
So that's a great question. I think that you can view it from both aspects. So it is part of the wheel. You're probably not going to be a very delighted customer if you can't use our tool in your language, but you expect to be able to use our tool in your language. So I think that is part of the flywheel, and it's part of making sure that the customer is actually happy with the tool that they're using. And also, in turn, that the customers of our customers are satisfied with the experience that they're being provided by the companies that use HubSpot as a platform, say, to host their website or to send their customer communication or email communication. So it's very important that both the customers that interact with us and the customers of our customers have a good experience in their language. So it's part of that delight aspect, but it's also part of the flywheel it's also part of the different aspects of the flywheel. because the marketing interaction or the sales interaction or services interaction, it needs to happen in the context of the user, and we need to meet our users where they are. If we're speaking to them in a completely different language that they don't understand, or if the experience that they see in that language is not fit to their market and is not fit to the expectation that they want to see in their culture, then we're not meeting the goal of what the flywheel should look like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How would you compare your current experience with the internship experience at Autodesk? We briefly talked about this before. You were talking about different maturity models. So can you maybe explain to us what was the difference in your opinion?
So at the time of the internship, I think my perspective was very, very fresh, and I hadn't had as much experience, of course, as I do now. So that's one very big difference. I look at things with the enrichment of the experience that I've had already. But I remember that at the time when I was at Autodesk, I thought, wow, this theory that we learned in class about the localization maturity model, I can really see it brought to life at Autodesk. Systems, processes, stakeholder relationships were really on that high end, the higher maturity end of the spectrum. And that was my impression at the time. And I think that still Autodesk is considered to be one of the most mature localization programs. At HubSpot, I think that we're also on the higher end of the maturity spectrum, but of course there are going to be parts of the organization or pockets of the organization that are, say, less mature in terms of systems or in terms of processes or in terms of stakeholder engagement. And I'm sure at Autodesk as well, if I had more experience at the time and could dig deeper and had more exposure, I would probably find these pockets of teams that have that are on the earlier maturity model than the ones that I had exposure to. So I think having seen the model out in the wild, it is actually very interesting to observe that the organization in itself can be called, very high maturity as a program, but you also have variations amongst different teams.
Right.
And it was a very enlightening moment for me to see that hands-on once I got to really dig into a localization program.
Yeah, because especially with a company like Autodesk, you always have new teams, like the company needs to expand, right? So there will be people who have no experience with localization whatsoever. They're just product teams, engineers, and that's where there's pretty much no maturity, right? Absolutely.
That's a really good point. And that also led me to think about mergers and acquisitions. Generally, M&As have a big role to play in the talent that comes in and how much localization maturity they themselves have. I think that's also something you just alluded to. Autodesk has had a lot of mergers and acquisitions. At HubSpot, we haven't had as many mergers and acquisitions, so most of the new stakeholders that we get to work with either are hired through organic growth or there are new opportunities that we get to explore as we reach out to different teams.
When you mentioned the high level of maturity, to me it seemed like that's the ideal state that companies want to get to. But I'm wondering, my thought was, isn't it also a danger to consider yourself to be on the high level of the maturity? Because maybe then you think like you're doing the right thing, but you're less open to new improvements. That's what I was thinking, that maybe if you don't consider HubSpot to be at the high end of the maturity, that maybe that's even better because you are more flexible and you are more exploring the opportunities how to do localization.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. It comes down to whether or not you view it as a static state or whether it's a constantly evolving state. And I guess in that context, state isn't the word that I should be using if it's evolving, but I guess if it's an evolving and
more like a mindset, right?
Exactly. Yes, that's a very good word for it. So to me, the goal would always to be in that growth mindset. But of course, we can always veer away from that or steer in the wrong direction, and nobody is immune to that. But the goal, I think the North Star should always be to be flexible and to iterate on the experience that you have with the different things that you've tried already, and try to always stay in tune with your stakeholders as well, because they're going to tell you so much about where you are. It's not, when you evaluate the maturity of your program, it's not something that you can do just on your own. It's something that your stakeholders have to do a very close exercise with you on in order to help you evaluate where you stand in that maturity model. So I think leaning into that feedback is very important. And yes, ideally we would all be growth oriented and we would constantly evaluate where we are.
So HubSpot is the software for salespeople and marketers. What exactly do you guys localize? What kind of content? Is it the software? Is it the blog articles? You mentioned e-learning before we started recording. What are the different aspects that you localize for HubSpot?
So I'm going to come back to the flywheel again, the flywheel concept. We try to target all of the areas of the flywheel, basically all of the interactions that our users or our customers are going to have with us. That would include the UI of the product that gets localized. Before a customer becomes a customer, they have certain interactions with us. So our website, which would include blog content, landing pages, content offers. I could go on and on and on about all the different content types that are in that part of the flywheel. During the sales interactions, of course, there's different content that needs to be localized. That's both part of the nice to have content, that it would be good to have different types of brochures and infographics and things like that. But it's also very important to have some of the legally binding contractual content that also gets localized. In short, I mean, I could go on and on, but there's lots of content that gets localized, e-learning or customer education being part of that as well. And if we look at the flywheel and the interactions that customers have with us, anything that fits into that flywheel and has an important impact to non-English speaking customers, we would localize.
So maybe my question should have been, how do you decide which content doesn't get localized? Is it about the money? Is it about the visibility? I assume that every part of the flywheel would ideally want to localize everything, but I assume that the reality is that you still have to say no to some things. What are the things that you say no to and why?
Of course. When we look at what we want to localize, we always look at the impact that it's going to have, the actual business impact, both for HubSpot as a company, but most importantly, what impact is it going to have to customers? If the content that we're localizing is table stakes for whatever reason, let's say that's a legally binding piece of content that just needs to be localized, but it's still going to affect a small customer base, we would still localize it. But if it's content that we see through our analytics doesn't get a lot of attraction even in English, we probably wouldn't decide to localize it. But we do have a lot of subject matter experts, and we're lucky in that our go-to-market strategy globally is very much focused on creating a tailored local strategy. So in the DACH market, you would have SEO experts, you would have customer education experts, general marketing experts who know what is important to that particular market.
Sorry, Gaya, maybe we can briefly explain what DACH means for some people who don't know.
So DACH are the German-speaking markets, Germany, Austria, Switzerland.
Okay. You can continue.
Similarly, for France, we have subject matter experts who inform our go-to-market strategy, and localization is a piece of that. They're the ones who do the market analysis, and they understand based on their analytics what actually works in their market, and localization is a partner at that table in terms of how we actually execute the localization strategy. But as as a company, we decide that on the local regional level.
So how do the country people affect what you do? You mentioned there is a local localization strategy, if I understood this correctly. Do they just, when we talk about the localization strategy, do you mean that they pick the content that you guys localize, like they are the decision makers, or do they also affect other processes or decisions that you guys have to do?
So they primarily inform what gets localized, as you said. They are the ones who decide, we have this particular campaign. We're trying to drive this particular demand generation goal or whatever it may be. And these are the assets that we're going to need for that. And those assets may be localized or they may be created natively. So localization is only one aspect of the go-to-market strategy and the way we create content locally. Yeah.
So when a content gets created from scratch for a local audience, are you responsible for that as well or no?
Our team is not responsible for creating content locally, but when we first set up our native strategy, the localization specialists on our team had a very close partnership with the marketing agencies that we ended up recruiting for native content creation. And that partnership is in the form of reviewing the initial content that they delivered during a certain period of time to give them guidance on how they can best reflect HubSpot's tone and voice, product and market positioning and things like that. And then, there are certain resources that we share with these agencies to make sure that HubSpot is speaking consistently, whether it's localized or if it's created from scratch in that language.
Got it. Okay. So let's talk about project management.
Sure.
I'm wondering, now we kind of understand the landscape of HubSpot localization. So how are the projects organized within all the localization that you guys do? And also you can explain to us the part where you think some of it is already program management.
Sure. So I'll start with the first part of your question on how the projects are organized. So we have certain teams that we have very close partnerships with, and over time they've organically developed. So let's say, as an example, marketing is a team that we have a very close partnership with. And the way projects usually come in is through our request form, and that's how we receive all the projects from our stakeholders. And then we have dedicated project managers for different regions. Because we have the dedicated project manager for each region, they have very close visibility into all the different requests in the pipeline. So on that level, they can have more thorough conversations and more in-depth, meaningful conversations with different stakeholders inside, let's say, France marketing, to determine what is coming, how are these requests actually tied together? And are there any commonalities that we can draw from this? It allows us to have some predictability for the entire localization program, and we can see certain patterns and trends so that we can adjust our resourcing accordingly. And the way this usually happens is the project manager who's responsible for, let's say, France marketing, if the project manager, if she notices that there's a specific spike in demand for a specific type of content, that can allow us to adjust resourcing with our localization agencies and also internally, because we do have a internal localization linguistic team. So as I started saying, we have certain teams that we have very established relationships with, and that's how requests come in. Sometimes those requests can be just for one language, to get, a content offer localized in one particular language. In some cases, we have an entire product launch, which will go into multiple languages. So it'll be a multilingual simultaneous launch. And in that case, we have multiple dependent assets that compose the entire product launch. And then that is primarily how the projects are structured. Any specific thing that I can focus in on?
I'm still trying to process this because to me, from what I understood, you mentioned that project manager is dedicated to a certain region. Is that correct? So
yes.
In the example that you mentioned, when you have a product launch into, let's say, a lot of languages, does it mean that multiple project managers would be working on it?
No, so we have the country designation by project manager, but anytime there's a global launch with multiple languages, that takes precedence over the country designation. So like, let's say if a product launch includes Spanish, French, German, and Japanese, we would not have 3 different project managers. We would have one project manager managing all of the languages. And that project manager would be working closely with the project managers responsible for the specific countries to make sure that the pipeline is being kept healthy and that there are no competing requests, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. In order to plan properly, do you get the requests in advance? Like, let's say, do you have something like a quarterly forecast, or is it just like, hey, we created this, can you please start localizing right now? Which is actually a common scenario many times, that the localization team doesn't have any visibility into what's in the pipeline. And I think this is what you guys solved. So how far ahead do you get information that something will need to be localized?
I wouldn't say we've solved it. I think
it's a work in progress, right?
We've come pretty far. We used to get a lot more ad hoc requests. And we also used to get requests that were not vetted for business impact. So we might get a request from an individual contributor inside the company who thinks it would be a good idea to localize this website page, but that individual contributor may have not consulted with the regional marketer to see, is there actual demand to have this localized? Do we have analytics to back up why we're going to localize this? A website page is maybe a very simple example because the cost of localizing a single website page is not that high. But if we look at something bigger, like an e-learning certification, that is a pretty significant investment. And as a localization team, we can't sign off on these types of projects without having analyzed the business impact. So we used to have scenarios where we would get these types of disconnected requests, but what we've tried to do is consolidate and make sure that we have responsible individuals in each function and in each market who are responsible for evaluating the business impact of a request before it comes to localization. So it needs to have that sign off before we even consider localizing it. And that's helped a lot because now we have, and we've done a lot of marketing and communication internally. So the wiki for us is sacred, and we have a lot of information on our internal wiki. We've created a lot of resources for our stakeholders across the organization to help them understand how we view localization and how the sign off on projects happens. So one of the processes that we describe is before you submit a localization request, because anybody can, the form is on the wiki, it's openly available, you can submit a request. But before you do that, make sure that you speak to the regional subject matter expert and confirm with them that there actually is a business impact. Or maybe that project is already in the pipeline and it's being forecasted in a different quarter and you might not be aware of it. So the important thing is to just communicate between individual contributors and subject matter experts in region.
You mentioned that for these requests to be signed off, it's always good to have it backed up by data, that it's something that the users will actually want. So what I'm thinking is, are we talking about, let's say, past performance of e-learnings in a certain region? So then you have kind of like this idea that, okay, people in this region like to consume e-learning, so we can create a new one. Or are we talking about having the analytics of English version first, and then you start localizing? So it would mean that the people in different regions would get the content later after the English users.
There are both scenarios. So for instance, we might take customer support data and see what kind of topics are customers most interested in or perhaps having trouble with in terms of tool adoption. And we might analyze that data for keywords or specific trends. That might be one, in order to understand what the regional cutouts look like. And not just, we wouldn't be looking at English, we would be looking at the regional trends as well. Sometimes if we don't have those analytics on a regional level, we might look at English and we might try to map that to our regional go-to-market strategy and understand okay, which tools are we focusing on developing adoption of in those specific markets? And what is the demand for that content in English? Do we see some patterns? So let's say the contact segmentation strategy is a big topic that the English-speaking audience likes to view e-learning content in. It also happens to be the adoption that we're trying to drive in the French market. We should select that content specifically to get localized or to be created natively.
So project management.
Yes.
What is project management for you? I've mentioned it several times whenever I have the chance that to me, many people still think that project management is about moving files here and there, left and right, file management and sending emails. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that's not your case. So what is project management for you?
So I think project management, of course, is composed of the technical aspects of project management and file moving. It is part of the technical aspects of being able to carry out certain project management processes. File moving can be part of that. But alongside those technical skills that you have as a project manager, I also feel that the biggest contribution you can have as a project manager is bringing in the big picture view and displaying leadership skills that are going to bring seemingly disconnected projects together and to show the big picture to multiple stakeholders, especially if you're working in a large organization where there are different teams working on different things at the same time. In localization, we have the huge advantage that we interface with all of these teams. So as a localization project manager, the biggest value you can bring is to see those patterns and to connect the dots. So, say the marketing team is working on a particular tool, and you see that there's also something being developed in the product that could be complementary to that. Bringing these different stakeholders to the table and helping them work together is a very important contribution that you can have as a localization project manager. And that's how I view my role. So the technical aspect, of course, I'm always going to be the project manager who's responsible for creating a schedule, who's responsible for creating the work breakdown structure and all of those things that must happen. But what's important to me is making sure that the work that I'm doing is in line with the greater company vision. And this is a little bit idealistic as well, but that's just me. I do see a greater purpose in the work that I do, or at least I like to see a greater purpose in it. And so to me, that big picture and bringing that to the table is very important.
Before you joined today, I was going over my notes and the questions that I prepared for you. And one of the bullet points was, what is your superpower? And I asked you this during our intro call last week or 2 weeks before. And I couldn't remember what it was, what you said, because for some reason I didn't take a note of that. But now I remember that this is exactly what you said is your superpower, connecting the dots. I think I also mentioned to you that I also think this is something that I'm good at. So I don't know how we're going to explain this to other people, but let's just start debating this. Do you think it's something that you get from the mother nature, or is this something you can develop yourself into to be able to connect the dots?
I wish I had a scientific response to that. I wish I had a more than anecdotal
Have you even thought about this before? Like my typical problem is that I usually expect other people to be good at what I'm good at, which is just not going to happen. So is this something that you had, like maybe since you were a child, that you were able to, connect the dots? Do you think it's a skill that people can learn, or is it just like you need to have it?
I think it's a little bit of both. And the reason I say this is because I'm by nature an optimist. I think you can always...
Okay.
And in this case, I also like to be an optimist. I don't know if I've had it since I was little, or if I was born with it per se. I do know that I try very hard to develop it as a skill and to always ask why. That helps so much.
The curiosity, right?
The curiosity, I think, really helps. And I think that, there's probably research on this. I'm sure there's research on this. Learning multiple languages activates parts of your brain that just naturally find patterns. To learn a language, you need to find patterns. So I think that's something that, to me, seems like almost a subconscious activity that happens in your brain, but it's definitely something you can train. And even if you're born with a little bit of a predisposition to it, you're going to have to train yourself, and you're going to have to, you just basically can't be lazy. You have to say, you have to ask the question why, even if something seems obvious, you sometimes just have to ask the question why to connect the dots.
I definitely think the curiosity helps a lot, because if you're curious, then you know more things, and then you have basically more dots to connect. So that's a very good way of putting it. I think so too. Yeah. So that was the project management for you. But you also mentioned that for some of the things that you do, it's more about program management. And many people, including me, I used to be confused by that because I didn't know what is the difference between project and program management. So what do you think is the difference? To me, it was always like program management is just a high level project management. But what is it for you?
So my book definition of it is dormant, and I don't remember what the book definition of it is, but I can try to compile it from observational experience. Project management, if you look at a project has a definitive start and end. It has a specific product that you're trying to achieve. A program is composed of multiple projects, but a program is long-lasting. There's not really a definitive end to it, although there may have been a start when that program was established, but there's no definitive end to it. And there's multiple outcomes from a program. And the purpose of a program is to combine multiple projects that drive a similar business impact, that drive toward, the same business impact, and manage those projects in an effective and efficient way, consolidate the resources and consolidate the knowledge under one specific umbrella. That way you're driving toward a specific goal. Is that a good definition? What do you think?
It is, yeah. Yeah, when I was working at Autodesk, and you know how the programs are organized, you work on a similar products that have a certain similar strategy, or the products are very similar, or they serve the very similar audience or customer base. So yeah, I think it makes sense. So now I think let's go fully on the ground, and let's start talking about very practical aspects of project management. So you mentioned that schedule. We will not talk about file management because that would probably be too boring. But let's talk about, you mentioned about the requests that come in. So how do you think about scheduling? Like, let's say you get a new request. What exactly do you do to create a schedule? Do you create a schedule for everything? And I could go on with more questions, but that would just confuse you. So I'll stop here.
How do I think of scheduling? So I like to think of scheduling on a macro level and a micro level. On a macro level, I think of it on the entire localization program scale. What are the different priorities for the company within the given quarter, the given year, and where does the project fit into that? The reason I like to point that out is because if within a given month or a given quarter, you have a big product launch and somebody approaches you from the company and asks you to localize a content offer, we're going to want to know on a macro level, what is the priority, the urgency and the importance of that specific request compared to that big product launch. And we need to have that macro 360 view of what's going on the company level in order to be able to prioritize things. We like to tell our stakeholders all the time, please just let us know as far in advance as possible what you're working on. we plan on a quarterly basis at least. So we plan at least 1 quarter ahead how we're going to allocate our resources, preferably even further ahead. But basically, that's the guideline that we give our stakeholders. If something has a very big impact on the business, the customer, or if it's just table stakes content that needs to be done, and you're aware of it, and you have just even the slightest indication that this is something that's going to be very important, and it's going to need localization resources, flag it as far in advance as possible. So that's kind of the macro level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Just one quick question. You mentioned table stakes 2 times, and I have absolutely no idea what it means.
So table stakes content is something that it needs to be localized. It's a must-have. If it's the GDPR compliance guidelines that the EU mandates you have localized into the languages that you operate in or the countries that you operate in, then you kind of can't really say, oh, we're not going to localize it. You have to localize it into those languages because the regulation mandates that you do. Or if the customer is just not going to be able to use what you're offering without that being localized, that is also something that we would consider table stakes. So basically, it's a must-have. You can't really decide not to localize it.
So going back to the schedule, you mentioned the macro schedule. How does it look like in reality for you? Do you really have some sort of a master schedule? And what kind of format is it? Do you have your own tool? Is it spreadsheet? How does it look like?
We absolutely have our own schedule, and we're very religious about updating it. And it's very scrappy. We just at one point decided we're going to create a PowerPoint presentation with a timeline with the different milestones on that PowerPoint presentation. And now I manage that presentation and keep it up to date and use it also for our external stakeholder communication. So we'll every quarter I export that presentation and put it on the wiki into a separate quarterly priorities wiki page. That way anybody at the company can see, okay, this is what the localization team is going to be focusing on. If I want to get something localized, I'd better not send it in August when there's this huge thing happening. I'd better send it earlier or later. That's how we hope it works. It doesn't always work that way, of course, but
how can you fit the whole schedule in a presentation? Are we talking about just one slide?
No, multiple slides. So it's a pretty complex presentation, I would say. And we also just indicate the biggest priorities. We don't put in anything that is more linear, let's say, that is not as complex as a product launch or any type of really complex content we wouldn't put on that schedule. But anything that is very complex and non-linear would go on that schedule. Otherwise, we also have different dashboards that indicate how much capacity we have on the team based on word count. That's kind of a proxy that we use to evaluate how much linguistic capacity we have, both externally through our localization agencies and internally through our internal linguistic team. So there's that combination of the presentation, which gives us the high-level milestones for what the company's priorities are. And then on an ongoing basis, we do have a dashboard that indicates where we are with our capacity.
So where does the dashboard exist? Is it in one of the TMS tools or is it something else?
We use Looker, which is a data analytics tool that the company HubSpot uses globally. Most of our teams have access to Looker, so it's something that is globally adopted, and it's easy for us to also give this to our stakeholders, and we speak the same language, and they're used to seeing the same data depiction and analytics approach.
Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about the word counts, how do the data fly into the dashboard? Do you have it connected, or is it the manual punch-in?
Through the magic of JIRA integration.
Oh, okay.
So we do all of our project management through JIRA, and in JIRA we have some custom fields where the word count gets pulled in from our CAT tool, and then that gets ferried over into the Looker dashboard.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Now this reminds me, because you mentioned the request form. I know that I was setting up something in JIRA for one of our customers, well, in my last job. But you mentioned the request form is in the wiki?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't create a ticket in JIRA, or does it?
It does. It does. So we have the request form, which is just a very plain Google request form, but there's some automation on the back end that auto-generates a JIRA ticket with the information that was entered by the user into the Google form.
Mm-hmm. And when we are talking about the dashboards, are you also utilizing the Kanban boards of JIRA to manage where the tickets are?
We do. For certain activities, we do use a Kanban board, but not across the board.
And one thing you mentioned before also was the work breakdown structure, which is a terrible word, and I don't think that people actually think about doing WBS when they do their projects, but they maybe do it instinctively. How does it work for you, the work breakdown structure?
I absolutely have a schedule with every project. It just depends on the complexity of the project, whether or not I go into a lot of detail. So if it's a linear project that I know the project team has a lot of experience carrying out already, there are no curveballs. Let's say like a content offer that contains a very standard structure and a standard workflow, I won't bother creating a super detailed schedule and a work breakdown structure. It'll be pretty much standard every single time. It'll go to translation, internal review, perhaps desktop publishing or formatting or something like that, QA, and then delivery. Mm-hmm. That would be like the boiled down version of it. So I wouldn't go into a lot of detail. I would still create a schedule to make sure that everybody involved has visibility into when their respective steps need to happen. But that would probably be the level of detail that I would go into. Now, for something more complex, the conversation is much more detailed, especially if we're working cross-functionally. For a recent example that comes to mind is when we localized a completely new part of our website and had to do a lot of technical setup. When you're working cross-functionally with the web team and you're working with the team that actually authors the content, but they use a different way of authoring the content than you're normally used to, you're going to have a much more detailed conversation around what other dependent assets or dependent steps need to happen before we can even get to localization. How do those teams need to be tagged in to do their part of the work? And that's when I would do a much more detailed work breakdown structure, probably not by the classic definition of the Project Management Institute or PMI, but a variation of it. And that's where I think you have to be a little bit flexible with the different types of projects that you encounter. And there's no reason why you should just go for the overkill and do a super detailed work breakdown structure every single time. But after working as a project manager for a little while, it becomes intuitive and you understand, oh, okay, so there's more complexity here because of either the stakeholders, the content, the technical setup, or something like that. It becomes almost muscle memory and very, very intuitive.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking, because I know when I was reading all the guides about project management when I was starting out or when I just wanted to become a project manager, it was like there's a project and then you draw boxes below, like what is part of the project and then what is part of that part, and then you go on. But I assume this is not what you do when you say you make a work breakdown structure. Do you combine it with creating the schedule? Kind of like a Gantt chart that you just break down the project and at the same time assign timeline to it, to each individual task of the project?
That's usually how I do it. Mm-hmm. What you mentioned earlier, that exercise is very useful. Drawing the different dependencies, it's very useful. I would even call it a mind map, really. You're trying to make sense of a complex process for yourself by using these different tools. And I call on parts of that technique and parts of those tools of mapping out the work breakdown structure and creating a schedule, but selectively. I don't always use all of these things, and some things I may have even forgotten from my formal project management training because I never really used it in practice.
Right.
Let's just say that a lot of the formal project management training and tools that are out there are geared toward very complex projects. I like to think like, if you were to take a man to the moon, that's what you would definitely need. You would definitely need to apply
or
all of these
construction
things.
Construction projects.
But for the context in which we work, or at least in my experience, there's only selectively things that you're going to need to use in project management. And I absolutely like boil it down to the things that I need. And I don't go for the overkill. I feel like that sometimes like we tend to veer in that direction when there's just too much complexity and we haven't made sense of things for ourselves. That's when we go toward even more complexity.
Absolutely. So very closely related to schedule is the budget. I'm wondering, how do you estimate the cost of the requests that come in? Do you have it somehow automated, or is there a human involved?
Parts of it are automated. Parts of it are automated depending on the content type. So without going into too much technical detail, parts of the content that live inside our CMS can be evaluated automatically. But then there are certain asset types that we've not reached that level of automation with yet. So for instance, video, imagery, things that are going to require human evaluation and human intervention to scope, and to evaluate for localization. Those things we haven't been able to automate. And I don't know if many good examples that have been able to automate, or companies that have been able to automate this, just because it is a human process. So what happens usually is part of it is automated. So anything that is text-based that lives in the CMS, that can be easily quoted, estimated. And then part of it, we rely a lot on our translation agencies to be transparent with us on their cost structure. We did a lot of work, and we truly appreciate the partnership of our localization agencies on that front. We've done a lot of work together to bring the predictability of the costs to a level where I can plug in the runtime of a video and get an approximate quote. And of course, the translation agency is going to do further analysis, but at least I know with like a 5% margin of error how much a 100-minute video is going to cost to subtitle or to voiceover.
And where do the numbers, all the projections and the actual cost live? Do you have something like, going back to Autodesk? I know that Autodesk had its own dedicated tool for financial planning and reporting. How does it work for HubSpot, if you can share?
So we use JIRA for financial projections as well. We have a bunch of custom fields that we've been able to program into JIRA, so that helps a lot. That's the data collection source. And then we have a custom reporting structure that allows us to export for our different stakeholders, be that finance or budgetary owners, or even ourselves, to be able to predict demand for certain services over time so that we can adjust our resourcing. So basically the data collection takes place in JIRA, and then we can manipulate that data outside of JIRA. One of the
most important things, in my opinion, for a project manager is being organized, being self-organized. Because if you cannot organize yourself, then how can you organize other people in the project? And this very closely ties to emails. Email to me is like a synonym for project manager, because all the information typically flows through email. So I'm wondering, are you guys still in the same level of communication, that most of it happens through email, or do you use different tools like Slack, or maybe just commenting on the JIRA tickets? And how do you deal with all the email overload? Like, what are your tips?
Yeah, I would say as a project manager, I don't have a lot of concerns around being overflooded with emails because our source of truth is JIRA. And I will get a notification from JIRA and it'll land in my inbox. And it's good that I get the notification, but I know that I'll never miss anything because I have my JIRA dashboard and I can go in at any time and check my projects and see where things stand. If I'm managing projects that are part of a program, I can go into the dashboard of the colleague who's managing that other project and I can retrieve the information that I need. So in terms of email, I feel like overall the load when it comes to inbox management for me now is not that high. It used to be much higher, especially when I used to work on the vendor side and I used to work for a localization agency myself. That was a lot higher volumes. We're talking like in the several hundreds of emails a day. I've had times that like in the 300s. And it's very difficult to disconnect and actually not check those emails after work. But I think it really depends on how you structure your communication channels. And we're fortunate that JIRA is there and we have that single source of truth. We also have other communication channels with our localization agencies. We use Asana for that. And of course, we use Slack as well. But at HubSpot, what I truly appreciate is that nobody expects you to be reactive to every single piece of communication that you receive. People do expect a certain response time from you and a certain courtesy for you to let them know if you're going to be late and responding to them. But there's never that pressure that you have to get back to your colleague within, let's say, a 5-hour window or an 8-hour window, something like that. And there's a lot of respect for personal time. And that I feel is so important. I never feel that somebody is going to keep badgering me because I haven't gotten back to them, and they'll understand if my Slack status says, hey, I'm focusing on something right now, please don't Slack me or something like that. So I appreciate that respect for personal time. And overall, I would have to say my inbox is not really a big concern for me. I log in every day, go through my inbox, get down to inbox 0, which is important for me.
Yep.
But sometimes I can even feel, okay, I'm falling behind on checking my emails, but that's all right. I've checked for the things that are most important by seeing who the sender is and what the subject line says. And if anything in there is not as high priority, I can get back to people later.
One thing that I noted down right now, because you mentioned that you have a different communication channel with the vendors, with the agencies that use Asana. So how do you manage JIRA and Asana together?
They're actually connected.
They are connected, okay.
They are connected, yes. So for security reasons, we don't give access to any external parties to our JIRA, and the two are connected. So they speak to each other and pass information between each other, but our vendors see everything in Asana.
And that's where they do their reporting?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about the relationships. No expectations, no pressure. I'm wondering, maybe we can split this into two categories. Let's say when you're working with a new team that you don't know, how do you establish that relationship? Versus the second question will be about someone that you've been working with for a long time. If there's any specific action that you still take when it comes to the relationship with someone that you already know and you're familiar with. So let's start with someone that's a new team. So a new team comes to you. They send a request form. How do you go about building the relationship with them?
So I start with a little bit of research. I like to go in and understand who does the requester report to in terms of the organization, and how are they connected to the overall company structure. That already allows me to understand which functional organization they're from. Are they under a product, marketing, sales, services, etc.? And then I can frame the conversation in a better way when I know what part of the organization they belong to, and bring in some of my past experiences with working with similar stakeholders from that organization, even just to inform myself. If I'm working with someone from product, let's say, I'll already know that, hey, our product team has an annual plan that they follow? Should I check to see if the request relates to parts of that annual plan? To put this into context for myself, so before I go into the conversation and have any type of communication with the person, I want to understand how the request that they've submitted fits into the bigger picture. So that's a little bit of that background research. And then, of course, I'll reach out and introduce myself and say, I'll be supporting you with this request. I wanted to put some time on your calendar to better understand what you're trying to accomplish. If it's something really straightforward, like please localize this paragraph to put on our German jobs page, then probably not worth initiating such a detailed discussion. So up to your discretion what you do there. But if it's something that I sense as part of a larger initiative and it comes with the whole connecting the dots approach of project management, then I'll schedule a separate meeting to try to understand what the stakeholder is trying to accomplish. And if perhaps the stakeholder has been delegated to in order to submit the localization project, but they're not the decision maker or the driver of the request themselves. I've made mistakes in the past where I've just assumed that I have all the information and I know that this is what they want us to do. And then I realize that, behind the scenes, there's a wider strategy and there's things that they have overlooked themselves. And I could have helped point those things out if I had known that there was a stakeholder driving the initiative. So I tried to do a little bit of that probing and understanding, how does this fit into your greater strategy? I see that, for instance, you're the project manager and you work with this product manager. Should we have this discussion together? Is this the only isolated thing that you need localized, or is there perhaps a wider part of the experience that we should be looking at? So having these types of probing conversations and balancing the consultative approach with a little bit of the prescriptive approach is very important. So telling people what you think would be useful to have versus actually saying that, hey, this looks disconnected. Let's not do it this way. Let's do it this other way.
Mm-hmm. This might be a stupid question, but you probably deal with a lot of people who have different experience with localization. Is it always easy for you to explain to them what is it that we do and what is the value that we bring? Or is it, if they already come to you with requests, that they already understand what localization does? Do you have to be in that position of an educator of a localization, or does everyone at HubSpot read Natalie's articles?
I wish they did, but unfortunately, I wouldn't say unfortunately, actually, it just is the way it is, similarly to how probably localization professionals don't always read the latest and greatest from the Unicode consortium. I'm sure that non-localization people also don't read all the localization insider material and educational resources. So I never assume that the stakeholder knows what localization is when it's a new stakeholder. Most often I assume the opposite by default, that I need to do a little bit of information sharing in order to help the stakeholder have a sense of how we're going to work together and what we will be able to do, what our scope of work is, what our mandate is, and then where they will need to meet us halfway and support us. So when I go into these conversations, I usually have a boiled down version of what we do as a team and what we are going to be able to do for the project. I go in using some common vernacular that we can both understand. So I always avoid terminology. That's just a good practice. And if I do have to use terminology, I'm not going to use the word translation memory without explaining what it is in a very basic way. Of course, this is common sense, I think, to most people. But my default assumption is that I will need to do a little bit of information sharing, and I have a boiled down version of it. As we progress in our relationship building, I reveal more and more information about the localization process. I try not to overload because, yes, they are our partner, of course, But at the same time, we are trying to solve for a multi-market need, and localization is just an aspect of that. And we shouldn't assume that just because they've come and reached out to us for help, that gives us the opportunity to dump all of our wisdom onto them. People don't want to be overwhelmed with
Here, take
a
the
whole bunch of
wisdom.
information. Exactly. So my approach is to kind of, I have a measured approach, and I don't like to go into the conversation with just, here's everything I know about localization.
Right, of course. And how does it work with the relationships that you have already established? Do you think like it's kind of like related to the maturity level that we were speaking about before? If you already know someone well and the program is working well with them, do you think it means there's less need to work on the relationships?
I think once you've established a certain level of understanding and a way of working together, that provides a good basis. You've kind of done the upfront work of setting up expectations and information sharing and meeting each other where each of you is. But the work is not done there, because any organization is constantly evolving, and the functional teams that you work with are also going to be evolving all the time. So that means they're going to have new priorities. They're going to have new impact that they want to make with multi-market customers. And it's important to continue to support them and have regular check-ins. So for me, if I get down to really the practical elements of maintaining relationships, it's about having some sort of regular sync up. Let that be, and you should come up with the cadence with your stakeholder and say, it seems like you have a quarterly priorities roadmap. What if we met at the beginning of each quarter, once a quarter, and reviewed those priorities and saw where localization fits into that, and if you're going to need any support from us? So having that kind of regular cadence meeting, I find, is very important with established relationships.
We were talking about the schedule and the budget. So we typically create these assets before we start a project, but then in many cases, the reality happens. So I'm wondering, how do you feel about planning and preparation for a project versus the ability to be able to improvise and fix things on the go?
So I think improvisation is a given. If you're not being flexible, you're just not being realistic, because life is going to happen and things are going to change. You can have the most well-crafted plan with a risk mitigation strategy and everything, and there's bound to be something that you overlook at one point or another. Maybe you get through tons of projects, and then the 21st project that you handle, there's one aspect that you didn't foresee. So to me, I think it's part of project management. You have to be flexible. You also have to try to plan as much as possible and create a risk mitigation strategy. It's also not an isolated process. It's not something that the project manager does by themselves. I know I don't do that by myself. I consult the different stakeholders who are involved in the project, especially if it's a complex one. I consult them to see what concerns or what risks they anticipate, and we work together to come up with a risk mitigation strategy. There are, of course, things that we're not going to be able to foresee. And at that point, you have to sit down and analyze the situation, do some fact finding, and just recognize what happened, do a good old-fashioned root cause analysis and a corrective action at a preventative action. So I think it's a very elemental part of the localization process or the project management process.
You talked about the risk mitigation plan. I'm wondering, how do you approach that thing? I know when I was taught about this, it was very simple. You just basically think about all the risks that can happen on a project, and you give them a score based on how likely they are to occur and what is the impact. And then you try to work it then you multiply the two scores, and then you just work from the top to the bottom. how do you go about risk mitigation? Because to me, especially when we're talking about projects that happen, let's say within an established program, like people just keep sending you requests and everything feels more like a production rather than each project being unique. I think in these cases, in many times, you don't need to have any risk plan. So how do you think about this risk mitigation? For which projects do you think they are important?
I think that there needs to be a risk analysis on the project level, but sometimes you need to do a risk analysis on the program level. And when it comes to the program level, it's really trying to consider those macro factors that surround the company and that the company itself might create. Factors, that the company might itself create. On the program level, when you do this type of risk mitigation analysis, you might consider things like new market regulations or the specific compliance rules that the company decides to put in place that might affect headcount allocation or budget or several different things to do with resourcing or stakeholders who are involved or technology. So there's that program level risk analysis, and that's something that the program manager usually does. On the project level, when I do a risk analysis, it again depends on the complexity of the project. If it's a complex project, I'll dedicate more time to it. If it's a less complex project, as you said, I'll probably, just do a quick pass at things to make sure I haven't overlooked anything, but I'm not going to spend too much time on a risk analysis there. For the more complex projects, as I mentioned earlier, it's a collaborative effort. I'm not going to put together a risk analysis plan all on my own and then kind of keep it in my pocket and never show it to anyone. Preferably when you're putting together a risk analysis plan, whether or not you're doing it for the program or for the project, you're doing this collaboratively with your stakeholders and the project team. That way you have the most comprehensive input from all different sides.
How are you guys? Well, HubSpot is a tech company. How are you guys utilizing, if you are, AI, especially when it comes to project management? You mentioned a lot of the connections between the different tools that help you automate. You don't have to move the data manually. But I'm wondering if there's any way how you guys are thinking about utilizing AI in project management, because so far I have actually, to be honest, I haven't heard anything.
I haven't either. Mm-hmm. And I would just make a clarification. The automation that is done in the back end, I wouldn't consider AI. I would consider that just,
it's just connecting the tools with API.
Typical API connection. It's not something that the tool learns on itself or adjusts in some sort of smart way. So far, we haven't really experimented much with AI in project management, and I myself also haven't, like you said, I haven't seen any trends in this area. I would say that for the most part, project management can be automated, but AI maybe can support certain steps, but I don't see project management being heavily automated through artificial intelligence, just because it is it's a human process, and there's humans involved from so many different sides that can impact how a project goes, that I think that it's not realistic to think of AI in the context of project management, at least not to the extent that it's going to have a significant impact. There might be some areas that could be enhanced through AI, but I think we're gonna need to wait quite a bit to see that happen.
Yeah, especially for the relationship part, right? Probably
right.
It's one of the key areas where a machine...
Well, that's true. Well, sometimes automation actually helps avoid having to even spend time creating these relationships. If you can automate detecting content creation, for instance, in some cases, you wouldn't need to interface with another human to ask, hey, when are you planning to update your knowledge base articles? You can just auto-detect that with some automation. So it's a little bit counter to what we try to do with relationship building, and it has its place, but at the same time, we shouldn't try to compensate for things that can be automated by leaning so heavily into relationship building, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would like you, especially since you are our dear project manager / program manager, if you could share with us, how does your day look like? We talked about getting organized, so I'm wondering if you have any fixed structure to how you like to start your day.
So my days really vary. Some days I start with meetings. Some days I start with inbox cleanup, and those are usually the two activities that I start with. It's basically catching up or having meetings. And as I said, my work structure, my day structure really varies from day to day. And I think the reason for that is because I work across many different time zones, and I have to kind of adjust my work schedule based on that. And also because in localization, we are always working with so many different teams cross-functionally that new things can surface from one day to the next. I might be working on my regular cadence projects one day, and then the next day I might find out that there's this big tool being worked on, and I need to consult on that and get a budget together and get estimates together and provide direction on how that tool needs to be configured. So sometimes it's a little bit of, you have to be somewhat reactive some days, and then other days you can plan your work more intentionally. So it's a fine balance between the two, being reactive and being more proactive and more balanced, and working on a regular cadence. But
if you could pick starting your day with cleaning the mailbox or doing meetings, which one would you actually prefer if you were in charge of that?
I would pick getting organized as the way to start the day. And whether that's cleaning up the inbox or catching up on things in general, or maybe even working on taking a training in the morning just to start the day very productively, I would take that. Whatever is going to make me feel productive. And maybe that's a very productive meeting that is going to help resolve or unblock things for the project team. I would be happy to do that as well. For me, the actual activity is not as important. The important thing is getting organized and getting things done early in the morning. Because then I feel charged for the rest of the day.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. You can see it in the background. I bought myself a whiteboard, and I'm developing this new habit for myself. And that habit is to start every morning with the most important thing. For a long time, I've been doing the, in book 0, like first I'll get rid of the smaller things so that I can have a peace in my mind. And then finally that beautiful, peaceful mind can work on the big thing. But in most cases, it's like in the afternoon, or like people still keep bothering you with more small things. And you're like, okay, I dealt with 80% of the small things. Now I'll deal with the 20% more, and then I'll start working on the big thing. And then usually it's the end of the day and I don't get done anything. So now I reversed it, and I try to, at least for 1 hour or for 2 hours, I work on the important thing that I actually selected the day before. So I end my night by selecting what I'm going to work on the next morning. So this is something that I'm learning. And like you said, it's really empowering, because first of all, it feels like you got the big thing out of your backlog, right? And then the smaller things, they feel like they're like easier to do. Like you can do them more efficiently, I feel like. Is this what you were referring to?
Yes, you're definitely way ahead of me on that one, though. I don't always manage to get such a well-structured and planned morning. I think sometimes that what impacts the way we plan our day is expectations from colleagues and the environment that you work in, and also the circumstances of the day. It may be that day specifically, you have to put out fires, and that's your mission for the day. Right. You have to just be reactive, and your colleagues are expecting a response from you. And you can kind of already gauge from the previous day when you wrap up your work, Should I expect something the next morning that is going to need my immediate action? Am I waiting for something? And if there is something that needs to be actioned immediately, and the expectation from your team is that you will do that. And I think unless you are very rigid with yourself and say, I'm actually going to get up an hour earlier that day and start my work day earlier and do that really important thing and not check my inbox. And then during my regular work hours, I'm going to start checking my inbox. For example, like let's say you're used to starting your day at 9, you'll start your day at 8 or 7 and do that really important thing that you want to do. And then at 9, when everybody expects you to already respond to the fires from the previous day, then you'll start responding to that. But yeah, I think it really varies from day to day and the expectations of that specific situation that you're working in from the previous day or even from the weeks before. The culture in which you operate is also very important. Lucky enough that I don't get badgered if I don't respond within a couple of hours or something. So that was very important. That is very important to me. But at the same time, as a project manager, you do feel a certain sense of responsibility for the overall fluidity of communication. And if you're not living by that fluidity of communication, then you can hold others accountable for it as well. That's kind of how I like to look at it.
One of the things that you just reminded me of was what I was trying to tell people, because I like to do these things where I just close everything. I leave a status that I'm working on something, important. I want to focus. So I'm not reading new messages. And if there's something really, really urgent, come to my desk and just poke me. And now that you were talking about the fires, I think in many cases, people exaggerate what a fire actually is and what is a priority, because I'm sure you know that many of your requests just say and come to you and say, this is priority for me, but everybody comes to you with priorities and in the end, they're not priorities. Or when people ask you something on Glip and they say, I need it immediately. When you ask more, why they need it immediately, then you find out it's mostly they were working on something and they just want to get unblocked by getting an answer from you or something like this, So what do you think about this? How do you actually know if the fire is a real fire or if it's just the smoke,
This reminded me of something that a close colleague of mine calls El Diablo, the devil. It's basically the devil that's on your back. Okay. We love it. And we kind of, we refer to it very often on our project management team at HubSpot when there's these different priorities that you're being torn between. You kind of want to slow down and ask yourself, is the other person's priority make it my priority? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it El Diablo, basically? Is it the devil that is kind of behind the scenes and trying to control everybody and giving everybody grief because, I don't know, so many things came together all at once and there's just a general feeling of being overwhelmed. So he calls it El Diablo and we all call it El Diablo and we love that. And it triggers us every time we hear El Diablo. We think, oh, okay, should I just slow down and question why this is actually a priority? Right. This might be just an insider thing. I hope I explained it the way my colleague Juan would have explained it. But yeah.
Okay. So when you think about El Diablo, what is the conclusion? Do you actually stop and analyze? Is this a real priority? Or what is the actual action that you take?
I think there's a few steps even before that need to happen. You need to understand for yourself that you are in control of the situation and the colleagues that you work with are just that, they're your colleagues. And then when you come from a understanding that you yourself also have control over your day and your work, that determines a lot how you're going to react to these types of situations. And then from there, my thought process is usually, who is this request coming from? What is the wider context? What is the timing? Have I asked all the questions that I could have asked to determine if this is a real priority? And then finally, is there a tiebreaker who can tell me, is this a real priority? Can I go to my manager? Can I go to my manager's manager? Can I go to someone who I know is a decision maker on this topic to help me understand if it's a real priority? So it's, I think once you just don't take it for a given that if somebody tells you it's important, then you have to do it and it's urgent and you just have to do it. Then you can have that kind of thought process and determine for your own, based on the context that you operate in and the company that you operate in, what a priority is for you.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about the day in your life, you wrote an article about working remotely on LinkedIn. I think it was your first article. So this is very relevant during these times when most of the people had to work from home. So did you have experience working from home before COVID? I assume you wrote the article before, right?
Yes.
So what were some of the insights? What were some of your tips that you shared?
So, I worked remotely before the pandemic, and my first experience working remotely was when I was working on the vendor side. At the time, after I finished my master's degree in Monterey, I moved to San Jose to work for an agency there. And I moved for 3 months to San Jose. And if you know a little bit about Monterey and compare it to San Jose, there's such different cities in the quality of life that they offer. San Jose is this really, to me, after Monterey, felt like this really big city, and it was just super hot, and everything was far apart from each other, and you had to drive everywhere. I didn't like that at all. After Monterey, I just wanted to be in a city where I could walk places. And for me, that was so important. So at the time, I was fortunate enough that the company allowed me to work part-time from home. So I could do 2 days or 3 days out of the week from home. And then the other days I would work from the office. And that was kind of my first taste of working remotely. But the problem was that the commute between Monterey and San Jose was very long. So it was at least 1.5, 2 hours each way. And that was like 4 hours out of my day each time I had to commute. Mm-hmm. And I truly felt that the physical office and the restriction of the physical office is so limiting to companies and the talent that they can acquire. Monterey is a tiny city with 20,000 people, and the only industries that you can really work for there are real estate, tourism, restoration. If I'm a young person living in Monterey, I have to commute out to the Silicon Valley if I want to continue living there. And that is very counter to the modern trends of diversity and inclusion, things I really believe in. I think you can get a lot of really great talent if you make it location agnostic. Obviously, I couldn't continue commuting for 4 hours, and I was lucky enough to get a full-time remote position with HubSpot. So I started at HubSpot in Monterey. I got to stay in the city that I loved, worked from there remotely. In localization, we are so fortunate that we work globally already. We work across many different time zones. So if we really reflect on the experience of working with different offices, it's almost the same. When you're working across different time zones in different offices and not physically together in one office, the experience is similar to working remotely with different colleagues. So the remote switch was not that difficult. I felt like I already had some of the muscle built from having worked in localization with multiple different offices and working with them across different time zones. One of the things that, as I started reflecting on what the different habits were when I was going full-time remote, one of the key things that I think make or break remote work is communication. If you don't have a healthy culture of communication as a foundation for your team or your company, remote work can just crumble. What I noticed during the pandemic, because our team is actually a hybrid. We have many people who are working remotely, like myself, and then we also have people who used to work up until now in a physical office. What I noticed is that the communication strengthened after we all went remote. It's probably because we were all a little bit worried that if we don't over-communicate, something might slip through the cracks. You can't just go to a colleague sitting at the other end of the room and say, hey, did you look at that thing? No, you now have to communicate it very clearly through JIRA, through Slack, through email, through some means of written communication. That way there's a written record of everything that is going on. Or, let's say it's a Zoom call, but it's a lot more intentional, even if it is just because we're all worried that we're going to miss something. I think it's a really good trend. And to answer your question, I went on a very long tangent here, but I wanted to make sure that I voiced the importance of diversity inclusion in the context of remote work. So coming back to your question originally, I think the underlying tip, if you want to call it that, is practice over communication and build that foundation in your team, in your company, and make sure that the company, if it really is a priority for you, if you're a leader at the company, if remote work is a priority for you, make that very clear. Dubious messages are what really veer us in the wrong direction. So if you tell people, hey, you can work remotely, but I'm going to put a time tracker on your laptop, I don't know if that really sends the same message of trust to your employees. So I don't want to be overly critical of any specific remote work management style, but I think it's very important for the people that work for a company to have clear, consistent communication on what remote work means for that company.
Mm-hmm. When we're talking about communication, are we talking about mostly communication related to work? Or how do you transfer the office chit-chat and the water cooler conversations when you're working from home? Like, do you have a dedicated time to just catch up with your colleagues remotely? Like, I don't know, some people have lunch together over Zoom, or just like a dedicated time where they just talk about nothing but work. I mean, everything but work. That's what I meant.
So our localization manager actually did set up water coolers for all of the different time zones. So there's one for Japan, one for EMEA, and one for North America, our Massachusetts office in Cambridge. So we do have these water coolers, but one of my favorite things so far has been kind of like a game night, if you want to call it that. Yeah. One of our team members organized an online game that we could all play together. I think it was Pictionary or something like that, where we had the word, only you had the word in front of you, and then you had to draw what the word was, and the others had to guess.
Right.
I had such a ball playing that game. It was so much fun, and we laughed together, and I thought that was a very, very nice way to spend some time together that was not work related at all. And I think these types of things, they're hard to replace. By all means, I think it's very important that we all go back to being able to see each other in person, hopefully sometime soon. But making the best out of a bad situation, so to speak, these types of games and just less standard mediums of interacting with each other are so important these days.
But is that what you would prefer, going back to the office? I know for some people they actually prefer staying at home and working from home.
So I actually don't really have the option of going back to an office because there's no office in the city that I live in. But
that's Hamburg, right?
Yes, in Hamburg we don't have an office, but we do have one in Berlin. And I used to love going to Berlin once or twice a quarter. I think having at least some elements of that human interaction with your colleagues is important. Perhaps working full-time out of an office is not so necessary for myself personally, but having the opportunity to at least travel and see them occasionally would be great.
I think there are two important things when it comes to working from home. One of the things that people struggle with is staying focused, especially the parents. I'm not sure if you're a parent already.
No, I'm not.
No. So, but even regardless of that, like for many people, when they come to the work, they just start working because what else can you do at work? But when you're at home, you can do so many other things. You can clean the dishes, do your laundry. How do you feel about focus? How do you stay focused yourself? It's
hard to say really at this point because it's become so easy to focus. It's so ingrained in my...
That's good.
It's become ingrained in my way of working by now. But I guess what I found useful at the beginning when I was just transitioning to working remotely is having specific blocks on your calendar. And it doesn't have to be the standard 9 to 6 workday or 9 to 5 workday, depending on how long you work. In some cases, when I used to be based in California, I had earlier starts in the day. So I would start maybe around 7 and work with EMEA. And then I'd have a longer break in the afternoon and then work with Japan. But I always had blocks on my calendar saying that, these are my meeting blocks and these are my focus time blocks and so on. So I would try to cluster things as much as possible and give myself some structure. And then the benefit of working remotely is that in an office, you can't just swat your colleague away if they tap you on the shoulder and just be like, please go away now. But you can mute Slack.
I do that sometimes. When people actually, and I think this is a strength when you can say no to people. Sometimes when I'm like really focusing on something, when I used to work from the office, and I'm really doing something, and like my colleague next to me asks like, Andre, can I have a question? I'm like, no. Or like in 5 minutes. Because it's like when you start getting into that other conversation, it like completely takes you out of what you were doing. Especially when I'm close to completing something, like let's say I'm working on a task, I'm writing like, let's say a long, important email for half an hour. And if I just need to finalize the final, let's say paragraph, then like you cannot do anything about it. Like I'll tell no to everyone. Like even if the president comes, I'll say no, like let me just finish this. Like I hate it so much when people interrupt me during work. So there is a possibility to say no to people even in the office. Sorry for the interruption.
No, not at all. I think first of all, good on you that you can do that. I don't know if all people can do that.
No, they cannot. It's very difficult to say no to people, to your colleagues, to your bosses, and to the people that you like. Yes, it's not easy.
Yeah, because we try to be nice, and
yeah.
That's kind of the default for us most of the time. But I would say that if you're not as comfortable telling someone, hey, please come back later, it's easier when you're working remotely to just mute Slack. As you said earlier, just put a status on Slack or whatever instant messaging service you use in your company that says, I'm focusing right now, not answering any messages, come back to me later. The world is not going to crumble in the 1 hour or 90 minutes that you're going to focus on your work.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's much easier to do that remotely. And I find that for me, in terms of focus, has actually been an added benefit. I can more intentionally structure my day, and I just have to hold myself accountable to that structure. Now, that's the hard part. Holding yourself accountable to it.
Yeah, because like all of us can put a block in our calendar that, okay, from here I'll do focused work. But then when the time comes, how do we actually put your mind to it? Is it just because you already developed that habit that you can really stick to it, or do you sometimes struggle? Let's say, for example, you take a lunch. Like typically after we take a meal, people are usually a little bit, sleepy, tired, they need a coffee, and they've been taking out of that work momentum. Do you struggle with this as well, or can you just instantly go back into the full work mode?
Some days I can, and some days I can't. It varies. And so what I would say is, whenever I find myself having trouble concentrating, then there's usually an underlying reason. It's maybe because I'm just avoiding getting that thing done because I don't enjoy working on that specific task. That might be the reason. It might be because I'm just overstimulated and have too many things going on in my mind, and I can't make order in my own mind to focus. And there are different things that you can do once you identify that and accept that you are not focusing. What I like to do sometimes if I have too many things on my mind and I feel overstimulated is I'll just take a pen and paper and write out all the things that are on my mind. And I don't know, it has this magical effect of at least pacifying and soothing my worries that I might forget to do something, or that thing is going to somehow pop up and, make me distracted.
That's very good because you're basically dumping your thoughts from your mind to the paper. So absolutely.
That's exactly what I like to do. And it has a magical effect. I don't know, there's maybe something meditative about it and it helps you clear your mind, but I find that it helps me so much.
Have you tried meditation or?
Not meditation per se, but breathing exercises. I like to, and I actually recently picked this up. At HubSpot, we have people fuel workshops. I don't know if you're familiar with the Energy Project, but it's an organization that has come up with a theory and a practical application of different ways of managing our energy. So our mental, physical, emotional, and physical. Did I say physical already? Physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual energy. There we go. There were 4 pillars. And I attended this workshop recently. One of the things that they helped us identify is ways we can relax and renew our energy in short periods of time. And one of the suggested techniques was a breathing exercise. You breathe in for 3 seconds, hold your breath for 2, and breathe out for 6. And do that a couple of times for maybe a minute or 2 minutes. I like to go out on the balcony and do that every now and then between meetings or something or a slot of time where I only have just a few minutes. It's new still, so it hasn't taken root. It's not really become a habit, but it does help.
That's, by the way, how I start my meditation. It's basically just breathing, like you said, like a deep inhale, hold it, and then just slowly exhale. Okay, we are running out of time, so I had my final set of questions. What are you curious about right now?
I'm curious about how the pandemic is going to shift and how our world is going to change, quite honestly. I don't have an original answer to this at all. I think it's on everybody's mind. I'm just wondering what our world is going to look like post-pandemic, or even with pandemic might be an option, in which case, we just have this for a long period of time and it is what it is.
Has the news impacted you in any way? Or are you at this point like, okay, there's COVID, people are talking about COVID, but I just live my life?
There were periods of anxiety because of the news, especially at the beginning, when it sank in that this is here to stay and this is a lot of uncertainty. I have family living abroad and I'm an expat living in Germany, and I don't even know when I'm going to be able to visit my family in the US. When that kind of sunk in and I understood that our reality is changing, that definitely affected me. I'm fortunate enough to live in a country where the situation is relatively stable. In Germany, really, it's been impressive how quickly things got under control. But my own situation is just part of the picture, of course. I'm not really affected by the pandemic in a way that many other people are and many other people in my life are. So knowing that my family in the US is in an unstable situation, knowing that I have friends and close ones all over the world who live in different countries and don't have that same type of stability, it does impact you in a way. And you always try to follow the news and see outside of your own country that you live in, what is going on, So yeah, in a sense, it has impacted me. And in another sense, living in Germany, you don't feel the impact directly on your day-to-day because things have gotten more or less to a normal state.
Mm-hmm. What are the things you changed your mind about? Something fundamental. Maybe just one hint. I mean, not a hint. Something that I've been talking about recently with some of my peers is introvert versus extrovert. Like if it's something that you think it's genetically given to us, and then over time we can change introversion or extroversion based on the outside factors.
I never believed in introversion and extroversion as a concept to begin with. I think that it's a sliding scale. We, in different environments, behave differently. There are some predispositions. I also don't think that it's something genetic or something that you're necessarily born with. It can change so much over time. So to me, I haven't really even changed my mind about it because I never believed in introversion and extroversion as the concept that's being defined in the classic sense.
So now this question is about us. What do you think is wrong with our industry?
I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with our industry per se. I think that sometimes what gets misinterpreted or miscommunicated is how localization is viewed in the greater picture. I think sometimes we think of ourselves in the localization industry as, we are the experts in localization and we know what we're talking about, and everybody else should just get with the program and then understand what we're saying. I think that has shifted over time quite a bit, but what I think needs to change and would really help us have more meaningful conversations with people that we work with who are not in the localization industry is how we view localization. And I view localization as a part of the go-to-market strategy. It is not localization as the end goal. It is just a part that then gets built on top of. There are so many things that come on top of localization that create the overall experience that our customers have with our company, with our brand. So viewing localization as this isolated end goal, I think, is what is sometimes misconceived by those of us who are very close to the industry. And we sometimes forget that localization is just part of a greater ecosystem of what happens. And we drive a certain impact through localization and through translation and through language and accessibility. But that's not the end goal.
Right. Another tricky question for you. What are the absurd or stupid things that you do?
So there's this one absurd thing that I think is absurd, but it has been passed down to me by my partner. He's very obsessive about making sure that after using the sink, everything is super dry and clean afterwards. And I didn't used to be that obsessed about it, but now I have this funny ritual that after every single time I use the sink, I have to wipe it down and make sure that it's super dry.
That brings memories. I know when I still used to live with my mom when I was a teenager, we built a new house, and in the bathroom there was a wooden sink. There was a sink, but around it there was wood. And she was always coming to check after me after I used the sink that I made sure that it was dry because it was corrupting the wood. And I was like, oh my God, why did we even build a bathroom like this? Because it just adds extra work for me. It's crazy. And now, actually, it's funny that you brought this up. Talking about the sink. I'm doing this leadership program right now as part of my self-development, and they give us these tasks that we need to do, assignments. And one of the assignments is that whenever we use a public washroom, we have to leave it in a better condition than when we entered it. So what I'm doing is I'm actually doing what you're doing at your home, but I'm doing it in public washrooms. When I go to a restaurant, I dry the water around the sink, and I clean the sink as well. So that's part of the assignment, and I just do it, and doing something new.
I think I can assume what the purpose is of the exercise, but what is the explanation that is given to you and why this is important?
There was no explanation given. It's just assignment, and that's it. But my assumption is that it's that we do something that doesn't benefit us at all, because I just leave the washroom and maybe I'll never come back. But it will be there for the benefit of others, which especially in my case, and I'm someone who's very selfish and egoistic and usually just only does things for his own benefit. That is a huge progress for me to clean the washroom for other people, But then also I'll also take it as just like a challenge, and I like challenges and like tasks, and I like, marking things complete. that's what the whiteboard is for. So I'm like, the benefit for me is that I did the assignment as it was requested. Okay. Yeah, this was a lovely interview. So final words from you. This is the last part of the interview. This is your opportunity to speak to the minds of everyone in the industry. What would you tell everyone?
I would say try to learn as much as possible about things that are outside of your direct responsibility. The biggest impact you can have is by connecting the dots. And you're likely working in an organization where localization is only part of the business, especially if you're working on the client side. So the biggest value you can drive is by understanding what the company is doing and what the different teams of the company are doing and connecting the dots. So even if you're learning something that is seemingly unrelated to what you do day to day, you're going to be able to apply that in one way or another. So try as much as possible to go out there and make connections, learn about what others are doing, and make an impact by connecting the dots.
Okay. Connecting the dots, that's the theme of our interview. Well, thank you very much, Gaya, for the interview. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Andre. Likewise, it was great to chat with you.
All right. Thank you. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.